Well, good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation on transatlantic relations in crisis, with an emphasis on European perspectives. If I could maybe even add a subtitle to this: "What now? What next?" And this probably this topic doesn't need too much introduction if all of you have been watching what transpired in Davos yesterday, but surely the events of the last week have put a lot of things front and center in terms of the transatlantic debate that were indeed already on the agenda, but in a way maybe history has been given a shove. And we'll have a wonderful conversation, I hope, here today, I'm sure, with colleagues of mine, to talk about exactly these issues, not just what we've seen in the last days, but some of the bigger issues that are out there and have indeed been there for some time, whether we're talking about trade or security or other matters. It's not an easy time in transatlantic relations. Let me maybe just tell you very briefly what we're planning to do, but also to introduce our speakers to you. First, maybe the speakers. First, we're delighted to have with us Peter Rasmussen, who is a founder of Olfi Media, based in Copenhagen, and I'm also very pleased to say a former Marshall Memorial Fellow. Peter, thank you very much for joining us. Peter is, among other things, focusing on defense and security issues. Perfect person to have with us, obviously. Martin Cassé, Senior Fellow for Strategic Foresight and Special Advisor to the President of GMF, based in Paris. Martin, thank you very much for being with us. And Georgina Wright, in London, Senior Fellow and Special Advisor to the President, who works well on lots of different things, not least trade. So a wonderful combination to talk to the issues that we're going to be looking at today. Maybe, Peter, if I could, I'll start with you, but first, just for our audience, so that you can be thinking about this, we'll open this up to everyone. Well, first, we're going to have some very brief comments from our panel, but then after that, we'll have a little bit of back and forth and follow up on some of the questions that have been raised. And then we'll open it up to all of you in our online audience. So please do have your eye on the Q&A function and put comments and questions in there, and we'll do our best to get to as many of them as we can, and we'll end promptly at 4 p.m. here, Brussels time. So, Peter, maybe I could start with you. How does this look from your perch? We were joking before we got online to say, well, I don't know if it's the epicenter or ground zero or however you want to say, but to be in Copenhagen in the middle of this extraordinary crisis is quite an interesting perch. But beyond that, also maybe to reflect very, very briefly on some of the bigger picture issues you see in the security and defense field coming off of that this extraordinary couple of days. Peter, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. Well, first of all, I will say that there is some kind of relief in Copenhagen and also in Greenland after the Donald Trump gave his speech in Davos in Switzerland yesterday evening. It is obvious that Donald Trump wants to own Greenland. He was very clear about that already back in 2019, where he said publicly he wanted to buy Greenland. At that time, the Danish Prime Minister also named Mette Frederiksen, replied that the idea was absurd. And that actually turned out that he canceled a visit to Copenhagen. At that time, he called her he called her a nasty woman. They met later on in 2020 in London for a NATO summit. And then Mette Frederiksen promised to build up the Danish forces in Greenland. And to be honest, nothing has happened since then. We decided to spend 200 million euro on building up defense in Greenland. But the thing was that the capabilities we wanted to buy, there was not sufficient money to buy those things, so nothing happened. Fast forward till 2024, Trump was elected, and already before taking office before Christmas 2024 and in January last year, he was very direct, saying he needed control and ownership over Greenland. and he couldn't refuse using military power. And since then, things have only built up more and more. And just the beginning of this year, right after Trump removed Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, next steps seem to be Greenland. We need ownership of Greenland because of national security. The thing is that those arguments he uses have never been accepted in Denmark because we have a defense agreement. So it was quite tense. And last week, Wednesday, our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, former Prime Minister, together with Vivian Motzfeldt, who is the Minister for Foreign Affairs in Greenland, traveled to Washington, met with Vice President J.D. Vance and with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And they actually lowered the temperature a little bit, deciding that the next step should be a high-level working group, deciding how could we move forward. The Danish, the kingdom's delegation very directly said, we have a red line. The red line is Greenland is not for sale. As Lars Løkke Rasmussen said in the Fox News show later that evening, he said, this is 2026. You can trade with people, but you do not trade people. Next day, on Friday, Caroline Leavitt in the White House said, well, they agreed to set down a high-level working group discussing technicalities, how we could acquire Greenland. And that was just, a pushback to where it all started from. And since then, tension has just risen. We have had stories in Denmark about the 11th Airborne Division, the so-called Arctic Angels in Alaska, who have 12,000 soldiers. 1,500 has gone to 4 hours warning. They have been exercising offensive operations, taking over airports in the Arctic. So the tension was extremely high. And then Donald Trump went to Davos saying, okay, I'm not going to use force to acquire Greenland, and I will now stop putting tariffs on Denmark and other NATO allies who have now started the exercise. So a bit of relief, but I also have to say, I think that the tension is not off. Donald Trump still wants to buy Greenland. And the big question right now in those minutes is, have Mark Rutte, the General Secretary of NATO, made a deal with the American president without having Denmark and Greenland at the table? The Greenland politicians are very well aware, and it has been very bold for many years that they have this politics, no decisions about Greenland without Greenland. And it has been the official politics of the Danish government. We don't discuss Greenland with anybody without participation of the Greenland representatives. So this is just like the temperature has lowered a little bit, but we are still working on, okay, what do they actually agree about? What will the next agreement include? And is it something they have decided over the heads of Denmark and Greenland?
Peter, thank you very much. And I mean, it leaves, of course, a very big open question of, was there a deal of some kind, and what does it contain? And maybe, too, the thought, I'd be interested in all of your views on this, is it a part of the strategy on the European side, maybe above all on the Danish side, to sort of, get this diplomacy in play, wait for political things to happen on the Washington side, and maybe some of this goes away eventually? That may be a little optimistic, but anyway, if you all have a thought about that, let me, Georgina, if I could come to you. I mean, you're in London. There has been a kind of particular UK take on some of this. Political figures in London have not been shy about weighing in on it. But there's also, and I know you follow this closely, the whole tariff side of this. Now, there's a big tariff picture and a big tariff issue that has, in a sense, been opened again. Because we thought we had a deal in Turnberry, and apparently maybe we don't have a deal anymore. But so that's one question. But also, how do you read this back and forth on the 10%, no 10%? What does all of this tell us?
Great.
Over to you. Very easy question. So over to you, Georgina.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I'm sure we'll have a chance to go into particularly the tariff question and the EU's potential response to that later on in the discussion. But it's really great to be here. I think I guess the first and primary message I've really taken away from this is that Brussels' thinking and calculation vis-a-vis the US administration has completely changed. This started at the start of the year, of course, when it was clear that President Trump wanted Greenland, the number of threats, the reasoning behind it, which was changed. It depended on the day and who you spoke to from the US administration. Some mentioned that it was for security reasons, national security reasons. Others saying that actually Denmark and other NATO allies, European NATO allies, hadn't done enough to secure Greenland, particularly from Russian and Chinese influence. And then there was also mention of critical minerals and that being essential for the United States. So I think that the fact that there was no clear reasoning behind and the fact that this followed on from the national security strategy where the US had sort of had a very critical stance on Europe. They made very clear how they were going to engage with Europeans. The fact that this was also happening with tariff threats on those countries that had, since the start of the year, said that they would increase military support to Greenland. And of course, alongside that, the whole question of the Board of Peace. So this attempt of President Trump to set up a Gaza Board of Peace and to sort of, for some people, they see this as an alternative to the United Nations. So all of this is taking place at the same time. And I think in Brussels, there has been a change in approach. Before it was very much, we need to favor diplomacy, we need to favor negotiation. The United States remains a critical ally. We are very dependent on the United States. We hear their criticism, we're going to address it. And now there seems to be pretty much since Davos, and we know that leaders are meeting tonight in Brussels in an extraordinary European Council, that there is a sense that we can't fully trust the United States. President Trump can change his mind on a whim. And actually, we need to be far more prepared because we cannot afford to be caught off guard. And I thought it was very interesting in Davos how, whether you were talking to EU commissioners or EU leaders, there was a shift in language from, being more autonomous to being independent. And there is a real sense that actually dependencies can be weaponized. They are sources of weakness and we need to address them. So I really think that in Brussels, there is a change in mindset of how we prepare and how we engage. But of course, ultimately, everyone is also relieved. The Danish government traveled to Washington because they wanted to favor diplomacy and negotiation. There was a hope that there was a de-escalation and a ramp down, and that has happened. So everyone is relieved, but people feel that they need to be far more prepared. And I think when it comes to London has been, yes, a little bit more perhaps guarded in its response, although it was very quick to say that it would support militarily Greenland, that Greenland's future is a question for Greenland and Denmark, and they've been sort of very, very clear on that. But there's also a sense that we need to continue working with the United States. We need to find ways of engaging the United States. But the coordination between London and Brussels has been essential. Maybe I'll stop there because I've been over 3 minutes, but I'm very happy to come back to the tariff question and also some of the trade options and maybe economic options to put pressure on the United States.
Okay, no, Georgina, thank you very much, and we'll certainly come back to those things. Martin, maybe share with us some thoughts from, your vantage point in Paris. I mean, that's one of the nicest things I think about GMF is that we have this geography on both sides of the Atlantic, and we can draw on that. But also maybe to say something more specific, how you see the NATO side of this. Many people saw, going into this Davos meeting as a kind of make and break moment, not just for that crisis, but indeed for NATO. Where do we go from here in terms of NATO? Where does this leave NATO? Would we simply, now does it, is this simply going to be a much more European NATO, which perhaps coming anyway, but again, history given a shove. But what do you think?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Great to be here with you. So a couple of thoughts on how France has perceived what has happened over the past few days. I think one of the main lessons learned as far as Paris is concerned is that Europeans can do escalation and that it can work. That you can, in the case of Greenland, create some facts on the ground with the deployment of a small amount of troops that were obviously not in any way a military deterrence, but more political signal. In the case of France, the announcement of the opening of a consulate in Greenland on February 6th was also a very strong signal that things were happening, whether while there's conversation and negotiation with the Trump administration, Europeans could also play the game of sort of a fait accompli and force the Americans to recalculate some of the costs that would come with a more aggressive confrontation with Europe on this. Obviously, the threat of 93 billion euro tariffs, the possibility to use the anti-coercion instrument that France has very quickly supported. I mean, this was all part of a new position, a new approach that said that there would be a very firm position against the Trump administration loose talk on Greenland. I think for France, one of the lessons learned as well is that despite the many divisions that we know within the EU, this was a situation where we've managed to keep a certain level of unity among European partners. And that is also something to build on for whatever comes next. Just like what Peter and Georgina said, no one in Paris thinks that the crisis is over. This is something that has been managed quite well in Davos and will allow Europeans to buy some time, but more to come. And I think that the announcement of a so-called deal is still very vague. And frankly, I've never met anyone in Paris who could say what's really in that deal at this point. I think beyond this, what's happened since the beginning of the year with Venezuela, the possibility of new US strikes on Iran, and now the question of Greenland, is a certain sense of prioritization by Europeans of these different security and strategic issues. And for France, quite clearly, Greenland was a red line. While you could feel that on Venezuela, it was harder to define exactly a position, even on Iran, when you think about the Macron message to Trump that Trump leaked a couple of days ago, he says, we can do great things on Iran. Quite unclear what he means here. On Greenland, this was a priority, this was coordinated work, and this is important. And that goes to my second point, is that during this sequence, for the French government, it is absolutely essential that we keep Ukraine at the center of the transatlantic security discussion, and that all these issues do not become a distraction to what is still perceived as the defining issue for the future of European security. And so we had that earlier on the meeting for the coalition of the willing, refusal to get sort of forced to discuss other issues when France wants to focus on Ukraine. And that comes to your question, Ian, with regards to NATO. I guess that we can say that Secretary Rutte managed to bring back NATO from a situation where people said that NATO might not survive this new crisis to one where NATO seems to be part, perhaps, of the solution. And in that sense, it's been a diplomatic success. Beyond that, the long-term trend remains the same. Yes, there is a Europeanization of NATO. The European defense effort will continue. The big question, as far as France is concerned, is what it means for the European defense industry and what it means for the position of leadership within the alliance. Everyone talks about burden sharing, burden shifting. What about leadership sharing within NATO? I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those thoughts. Let me maybe come back to you, Peter, because I know you also look at the NATO issues quite closely, and maybe just to pick up on a couple of, well, something that Martin mentioned, but how do you see it from a Danish point of view? I mean, this is no longer, it seems to me, a debate about burden sharing, except perhaps in the narrower sense that a much stronger NATO commitment to security in the Arctic could diffuse some of the debate that it takes place even in Congress about this. Because I think, in fact, when push comes to shove, I suspect that there are political forces that even President Trump needs to confront that are very wary of doing anything that really jeopardizes the future of NATO. But let me ask you on some of those points that Martin made about NATO. Are those broadly shared in Copenhagen? I mean, are we back on a better course, or still trouble ahead?
Definitely. Our Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, said, if Donald Trump and the US invade Greenland with military forces, everything comes to an end. And I think she's correct, because if the superpower NATO had invaded another NATO country, it would have been a bigger earthquake than we have seen over the last year. So there is a strong feeling, not just in Europe, not just in Denmark, but in Europe, to keep NATO alive and keep NATO strong. And therefore, we need to keep the US inside NATO, but it has also become very, very clear, not just to Denmark, but to the rest of Europe, that we have definitely to step up. We have to be able in Europe to defend Europe without the US. I know that they will probably stay with forces, but anyway, it is obvious, and I think all European leaders has understood that we need to be able to defend ourselves. And if I put on the optimistic glasses, I think that crisis can reform things and make changes that brings us a better place. So even though there's a crisis now with NATO, with the war in Ukraine, it has not ended. Where do we have the US? I think if we look at the long perspective, I'm quite optimistic, because I think that NATO will stand stronger in a couple of years. It will not be ready tomorrow to defend Europe without the United States. That's also why I am a little bit pessimistic about what is going on in Ukraine, because we totally need the United States to solve the war in Ukraine. If the US doesn't want to engage, we are in a very bad situation, because we do not have the power, we do not have the capacity, we do not have the soldiers to be able to make Ukraine win the war. But for me, it's obvious that all members of the alliance are so eager to keep this alive and come over those obstacles and out on the other side with a stronger NATO. So looking at what is going on other places like in Iran and otherwise, I think that we're better to try to keep this together and try to find a way together with the United States.
Okay, Peter, thank you. Georgina, I really want to come back to you now on the trade and economy front. Sort of the political economy of this crisis. I mean, in some sense, I don't know if you would agree, but if you look over the transition of the last year's debate and what's happened on the trade front, we started out talking about trade imbalances, how perceived, how to fix, etc. And we're now in a place where tariffs are really being used in a sense as sanctions, or you have both things going on at once. But share some thoughts with us about this. I mean, what can we expect, next on the trade front across the Atlantic?
It's a wide question. I think only President Trump probably can answer that question with some degree of certainty. I think you're right to say, this precedes Trump's first term, actually, that a real sense in the United States, but also in parts of Europe, France, for example, that actually the global trading system wasn't perfect, and that actually some people had really lost from it, and that actually it did need redressing. There was also significant concern in Europe that actually the market was much more open than, say, other markets, for example, China, but also at times the United States, and that there were certain parts of industry that were dying as a consequence. So this has been a live debate for a very long time. But of course, the reality is that our global system is incredibly integrated, right? Our supply chains are integrated. Some of our most thriving European businesses are multinational businesses that kind of produce or invest in different parts of the world. So it's not as easy as just putting tariffs up. And Kiel Institute just published a very interesting report that has been tracking the sort of liberation tariffs and the existing new US tariffs, and it shows very much that the burden and the cost of those tariffs is being carried by Americans, right, and felt by Americans, not necessarily by exporters. But that said, you're right that I think President Trump has an approach where he sees tariff as a useful tool for multiple things. He's been quite clear about that. Some of it is about just bringing in money into the coffers. The other is to reshore some manufacturing, just make it more complicated for exporters to export to the United States. And so as a consequence, the sense that maybe this will produce in some way or accelerate production on American soil. And then he's also said very explicitly that he uses this as leverage to get other countries to change their policies and to change their minds. And so we know that's particularly the case with digital policy, for example. The Trump administration has made very clear they don't like European regulation on tech. They want it to change, and they won't hesitate to tariff more to get that. So it is very much a bargaining tool. I think where this leaves the United States and Europe, I mean, in a sense, tariffs mainly target goods, but actually a lot of the bilateral relationship is around investment, and that has continued to be very important. So actually there's been an increase in European investment in the United States since President Trump has been in power, and vice versa. The investment continues to be strong, and that's because the United States is a very attractive market, right? They've got great institutes, innovation, ecosystems, easy access to capital. Their labor laws are much more flexible and less stringent. And so there are real questions, I think, for Europeans about when we think about competitiveness. It's not just a question of tariffs, it's also how attractive our market is. But I think, and there's a question in the chat, which I'm sure we'll come to, about the EU's response to Trump's threat of tariffing countries to get them to in some way agree for Greenland to become American. I think there are the European Union, but also the UK and other European countries have tools that they can use to put pressure on the United States and respond when they think that actually the economic coercion is going too far. And as I said, I think that has really been the major shift that I've noticed in Brussels, is they are thinking much more about this. They're like, yes, we will favor diplomacy, and of course we will favor negotiation, and of course there are things that we need to work with in the United States, but we need to really have a huge arsenal of very strong economic measures that we can hit the administration with when we think it goes too far.
So, Georgina, will they? I mean, and this gets a little bit to one of the questions in the chat, and actually in the Q&A function, I encourage others to put them in. There are some very good ones there. We'll get to them. But one of them does concern the anti-coercion instrument. First of all, there's a question of how this is seen in Washington. Is it taken seriously? Will it be used?
So Matt knows this because we've had conversations about it. I get a bit annoyed around the anti-coercion instrument debate because I feel like it's thrown out sort of, we need to do this and we need to use it, and people don't exactly understand how it works or what the application means. The anti-coercion instrument it's very expansive and you can use it in multiple ways, but essentially the Commission would put forward a proposal EU governments have to accept it, and it can vary from anything from sanctioning individuals or sanctioning companies to cutting off market access to certain sectors. So you can imagine if you're a tech firm, suddenly they say, right, Amazon, no more access to the EU market. It can be retaliatory tariffs. It can also be very specific in terms of investment or access to European procurement. So like there are a number of ways that you can deploy and apply this instrument. It undoubtedly would hurt Europeans, right? It hurts European businesses, particularly those that are very integrated in the United States. And so it's not just a question of, oh, we're going to cut off market access and that was the whole debate that we had around the liberation tariffs last year when President Trump and people were saying we should deploy the anti-coercion instrument. I was very much of the mind we have to favor negotiation because the anti-coercion instrument is nuclear and it will hurt European economy at a time when Europe has energy costs that are 3 or 4 times higher, at the time when we have our own competitiveness challenges. But this year, the discussion around deploying it felt much more credible, and I think there were a majority of member states that were ready to deploy it because it wasn't just about tariffs, right? It was about taking over potentially invading a NATO territory. It was about all the national security strategy and sort of the Trump administration's position on Europe. It was much more than tariffs. And so there was a sense in Europe that actually clearly diplomacy negotiation is not working and we need to show much more strength. And we can, they can hurt the US economy, but that carries risks. We need to accept that it will hurt us in some way as well, but perhaps that's the price to pay to then find an off-ramp. So I think the ACI, yes, they were ready to deploy it this time. I think the view was very much it has to be applied in a staged process, so it has to be expansive enough that it's credible as a deterrent, but it should also give us, it shouldn't be the sort of finalized and or finite application of the anti-coercion instrument because it's very likely the Trump administration would replicate with further retaliation. So we need to be able to escalate further. And in the same case, we need to be able to de-escalate. So there was the whole thing about how do you apply it? So my gripe with the debate was we should deploy it. And my question was, well, how should we deploy it? And I've been thinking a lot about that. Finally, very quickly on how is it perceived in Washington? I think I've said this before many times. Trump 2 administration is much more prepared than Trump 1. They know what the anti-coercion instrument is. They know that it was developed in response to the Trump 1 administration, even though it's never been used. Or it has tentatively in the case of China, but not in the way that we might have seen it been deployed over the past week. But they know what they're dealing with, and they have multiple ways that they can respond to an anti-coercion, so the deployment of an anti-coercion instrument. I think that's very key. The second is Congress is much more mixed. I think people in Congress don't really know what the anti-coercion instrument is. There was a bipartisan, I think, push on military intervention in Greenland, which was, this is a red line. We couldn't prevent it, but we can certainly reduce the budget. There are ways that we could make this very difficult for the Trump administration. On economic coercion and tariffs, there was some people came out and said they thought it was bad, but others didn't really. So I think around Congress, there's really minimal understanding of what it is. But that's also because there's minimal understanding in Europe of how it would be deployed because it has never been deployed in the way that would be effective. So we shall wait and see. But bottom line, I think Brussels is very serious in contemplating it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Let me come back to, we have a lot of questions that have come in. There's one, obviously what we're talking about here, we're talking about a crisis, we're talking about its transatlantic implications, we're talking about those set of things, but there are global implications here, not least when one considers a world in which sovereignty and the territorial order is not necessarily fixed, all of those things. They also have application, obviously, and relevance in the Indo-Pacific. And there's a question here from David Camrou, if I can say, if I can just summarize it briefly. It says that after a year of Trump 2, these questions of unreliable, unpredictable, what does it all mean for transatlantic dialogue? But what does it really mean in an Indo-Pacific setting as well, where some of these questions of trust, credibility, and how the United States and Europe can work together are just as relevant? Martin, maybe anyone would like to weigh in, but Martin, maybe for you, what does this mean if you were to put yourself out into the Indo-Pacific and look at this unfolding situation? against the backdrop of Ukraine as well. What does it tell us in that setting?
The thing is, since the beginning of the second Trump administration, the issue regarding transatlantic cooperation in the Indo-Pacific is not so much that transatlantic tensions make it difficult to work with the US, is that the Trump administration has not been interested at all in even engaging in a sort of constructive dialogue with Europeans on what to do with regards to security issues in the Indo-Pacific. And I can say that there's been a number of attempts from different European countries, France in particular, but not only, to engage with the Trump administration on China, on the security order in the Indo-Pacific, and to see it as one issue where there is opportunity for dialogue and cooperation with the US. And they have received very little answer. So I don't see necessarily the unreliability or unpredictability of the relationship as the problem here. I find it just very difficult for European allies to understand what the US is expecting of Europe with regards to China, with regards to the Indo-Pacific. And I would say, having had a chance to talk about it with a number of US partners around the world, and not only in Europe, this is a question that most countries try to address and resolve themselves. It is not only Europe that doesn't really know what to do with regards to the Indo-Pacific and what to do of Trump's China policy today. Most US partners have the same issue. I would say, though, that to come back to my point about prioritization of issues, I think that as it becomes the future of the European security order is at stake, both in the case of Ukraine and to a certain extent with what happened in Greenland right now, I think that the Europeans will still be very much engaged with what's happening in the Indo-Pacific or in the neighborhood in the south, but they will have to prioritize. And there is a limited bandwidth for political leaders, for the staff. And so, unfortunately, I don't foresee Europe to do more on the Indo-Pacific, given the problems that we may face in 2026 in Europe first.
Yeah, no, Martin, thank you. Peter, there's a question here, and I think it maybe most naturally goes to you, asking about actually the scope for the United States to do more with its bases on Greenland, and the model of the UK bases on Cyprus is mentioned. My understanding is that, in fact, there's considerable scope even under the current treaties if the United States wanted to expand its security presence there. But how would you see this going? And maybe if I could add to this question, the relationship to this bigger issue of whether the U.S. will in the end buy Greenland. Yes, a red line, but is it really a red line? Or maybe it's a dotted red line. What's your own sort of personal sense of where that could go, and how long it would take for any of that to happen?
I think it is definitely a red line, and it's maybe necessary to say that America, the United States, have had military access to Greenland since the Second World War. The first agreement between Denmark and the United States was made during the Second World War while we were under the Nazi regime. And it was made by at that time, Danish ambassador to Washington. And when the war finished, it became ratified by the Danish parliament. And just after NATO was established in 1949, we made the official NATO defense agreement between Denmark and the United States in 1951. And in 2004, it was ratified once again with the Greenland self-government stepping in as a third part of the defense agreement. And the defense agreement says that the Kingdom of Denmark has the sovereignty over Greenland. Greenland is a self-governed country. And the United States has all possibilities to build bases in Greenland. They only have to ask before they do it. During the Cold War, the US had 17 bases in Greenland. They had about 10,000 soldiers in Greenland. Today, they have only one base, that is the punitive space base, formerly known as Thule Air Base. They have about 120 soldiers up there. And it is still on the Kingdom of Denmark's soil. So it's not a sovereign part of Greenland that US owns. It is a base they have in the Kingdom of Denmark. And there is no possibility with the ongoing defense agreement that the United States could get sovereignty over any places in Greenland. I'm pretty sure that that is one of the things that is the aim of Donald Trump's pressure on Greenland. He wants to own, if not the whole Greenland, I'm pretty sure he wants to own parts of Greenland. So he could make the bases American. And I think it's very, we need to understand that when he talks about a threat towards Greenland, in the European and Danish perspective, there is no military threat towards Greenland. Greenland is, as Donald Trump says, one big island, one piece of ice. There's nothing in there. It's just ice. You have about 57,000 people living in mainly two bigger cities. In Nuuk, you have about, I think it's about 20,000 people, 20 to 30,000 people, and the rest is in small fjords where you have no infrastructure. There are no roads. The only way you can access to those small fjords is by helicopter or by ship. So the military threat is because Greenland is a strategic, very important piece of land for the US. And the whole idea with having the punitive space base is that this is possible from there to watch what's happening in the space. So you can detect missiles coming from Russia or China towards the US from Greenland, and you can shoot them down from the US. So I'm pretty sure that is the main. US already can do whatever it wants when you look at the military thing. I think from my and from a lot of people's opinion, what Donald Trump really wants in Greenland is that he has those tech billionaires that has sponsored his campaigns, and the tech industry wants to get into Greenland because they need the rare minerals in the soil under the ice. They also need Greenland because it's better to build those technic IT centers with servers in. Why build them in Texas with high temperatures when you can put them in Greenland when it's always cold? They also need Greenland to be able to build those free cities where the tech industry can build a city before they move to Mars. And a third thing that we have heard is that the tech industry, they are now thinking about Mars as the next innovative adventure. And to get to Mars, you need to do a lot of rocket launches, and it's much easier to launch rockets from Greenland and from the poles because there's not a lot of airplane traffic. So there are a lot of sub goals and things that Donald Trump wants to do with Greenland that has nothing to do with security except of what he could already do.
Yeah. Okay, Martin, maybe I could come to you. There are a number of questions here that revolve around, what more can Europe do if this issue is not resolved, if indeed, in a broader sense, transatlantic tension gets worse. And, there are two sort of sides to this. One, there's a set of questions about, does this finally really drive the European Union into a much more active effort towards strategic autonomy, let me say, since you're in Paris. But finally, that gap between aspiration and reality closes, and it closes more quickly than it might have otherwise done. And then also this question of, on a practical level, would one response be for Europe to simply say, right, we're not buying any more US defense goods and services. Is that a practical reality? So the defense autonomy thing on the one side, and this question of the defense industrial piece on the other.
Yeah, I think this is. I mean, over the past 10 years, I've a hard time counting the number of times we heard this is the wake-up call moment for Europe. This is the time when finally there's going to be an understanding that European needs to do more for its own security. So I remain, I'd say, cautious. We've heard that too many times. And I think in truth, most of the effort that need to be done from a purely from a political standpoint has started. In terms of the defense spending, there's been now a consensus in most European countries to increase. The question is how to do it. So it's more of a technical issue. And from a strategic standpoint, whether there is the ability to develop a sort of European way of war that would align the different European military in a way to compensate for, I'd say, a more reduced US presence in Europe. And this is more now the question of the timing, whether we can agree with the Americans on an orderly transition that will take 5 to 10 years, or if it is something that at some point the DoD will say you have 12 to 18 months to compensate for X amount of US troops leaving the continent. So this is, for me, not so much the moment that will change much of the debate. However, there's something a bit deeper, a bit more political happening now. And that relates to your question about the defense industry. I think that what started in January this year in France and in other European countries is the beginning of a great trend of anti-Americanism in Europe. I think in many countries, the reaction will not be necessarily that our policymakers will make that shift that was implicit in your question about the wake-up call. It is more that politically, because of the tension that we've seen, because of the misunderstanding, I think, it will be a political win to appear tougher on the US and to a certain extent to take an anti-American position. So in a country like France that has a presidential election in a bit more than 12 months, you could expect this to just grow as a political force. And what's interesting here is that the indirect implication of the Trump administration policy on Greenland or on other European issues is that it might strengthen anti-American movements, pro-European movements in a sort of bi-European sense of the term, and will make it more difficult for US companies and US industries to have access to some of the new funding for defense. So this is where sort of we'll see it becoming a bit more difficult for the US administration, I believe, to reconcile this policy that is brutish sometimes towards European and its continuous interest in having US companies benefiting from the increase in European defense funding. As you know, Europe is not one political environment. There are many national debates, and this will take different forms. But I expect that in case of big economies like the French economy, perhaps the German economy, this anti-Americanism that will become more structural will have an impact on the security and industrial debate in the years to come.
Georgina, do you think that some of the points that Martin just made also resonate in the UK? The anti-Americanism, even the discomfort, I would say, in kind of, I would look at the comments that Nigel Farage made the other day. I mean, I think this is true actually across Europe. You see parties on the hard right even with these sovereigntist interests looking at this situation and saying, this doesn't sit well with us either. But how would you read that in a UK context? And if I could also just throw another question too. There was a specific question about whether the EU might respond by restricting American service companies' access to the European market. So those two things, UK, services where we have a surplus, in fact, as the US.
Great. I mean, I'm mindful of time and I could go on for a very, very long time. Just on the UK, it's different. Their approach to the US is different, and that's both for historical, cultural, sometimes that's floated, but also kind of political reasons where the special relationship is really important to any government, and there is a sense that we are very dependent on the United States. Like our militaries are very integrated, our intelligence services are very integrated. The UK, with Trump's state visit last year, there were big announcements about investment in the UK's tech and AI industry. And there was a very deliberate positioning of London, which is we want to be the #1 destination for US tech. Foreign direct investment, and we want that to be, and we believe, and because in London the view is the choice is between the United States and China, and we know which basket we want to put our eggs in, and the sort of thinking that we can replicate what the United States have is a bit pie in the sky, but actually we have really good innovation ecosystems, we have very good industries that the United States needs, and we can work together. So it's there is certainly when President Trump came for the state visit, there was all this talk about how much are we going to have carriages in the street because there will be protests. President Trump is not a popular US president in the UK, that's for sure. But if you take away the person of President Trump, there is still a sense that we are better working together than we're not, and that's always been the case, and it will always be the preference of the UK. But having said that, there are some of the same discussions that you're hearing on continental Europe happening right now in the UK. Should we boycott some of the US goods if they go as far as tariff us because we're prepared to provide more military support to another NATO ally? Should we are US Treasuries safe assets? A lot of pension funds have that they are big sort of purchasers of US Treasuries because they've always considered them safe assets. Is that a dependence? Can it be weaponized? President Trump today was asked, I think, by Fox News and said, how do you feel about all these Europeans? Because we've had a Danish pension fund, we had a Swedish pension fund saying that they were going to sell their US Treasury assets. And he said, Europe better not do that or we will retaliate massively. But that discussion is live in the UK. And there are parts of the political ecosystem that are how much do we want to be dependent on US social media platforms? Because actually there are problems with algorithm, the way people access news, misinformation is ripe, and also minors and what they can access online. So it's not black and white, but I certainly think that there is more willingness to seek cooperation than perhaps there is in continental Europe. So, and then on the services point, very much so. When discussions in Brussels about the use of anti-coercion instrument, it was very much we have to target US services because the Trump administration cares about what some of these big CEOs, big US services think. They might have some sway over the way that he thinks, but also they are, that would be one way of hitting the US credibly. Even if it means that we will be penalizing ourselves because a lot of our businesses are reliant on US services. So it was very much around services as much as it was retaliating by putting tariffs on goods.
Georgina, thank you. And now I'm conscious of our time as well, but maybe, Peter, I could come to you with one very specific question that was asked about resources and investment on Greenland that, there, and you alluded to this earlier, the sense that somehow this is this tremendous resource waiting to be exploited. In fact, it's very difficult for all kinds of technical, financial, but also apparently, social license reasons. It's just not easy to do mining above all in Greenland, and that's been the history. Any prospect for that to change?
No, and I think that the American tech industry will realize how difficult it is to get to the rare earth minerals in Greenland. And there's a reason it has not been done yet, but because, believe me, a lot of companies have had interest in trying to do so. But the thing is, you have no roads, you have no harbors, you have no airports in those areas. So you have to create everything from the very beginning. And on top of that, you have to do it in a climate where the temperatures could go below 50 degrees Celsius. And you have to be there all year round. So summertime may be okay, but during wintertime, it is the most harsh environmental area on Earth. And I think that the tech industry will get surprised how expensive it would be to try to get to those raw or rare minerals. It might be possible somewhere, but I'm very sure it may not be possible in the sense that the tech industry thinks it's possible.
Okay, thank you. We've got exactly 4 minutes, and I want to do one thing, 30 seconds apiece, if you could. Just tell us what could surprise us over the next year that would affect these issues we're talking about. Yeah, really short.
I think that
Peter, go ahead.
maybe not surprised, but Donald Trump could return to his position that he wants to own Greenland. And that would not be a surprise for anybody, but that would just bring us back to where we started.
Georgina?
I think two things. I know you've said one. The first is that President Trump could very much decide tomorrow, as Peter just said, that he wants Greenland and change his approach. But secondly, I think we will see an EU response that is much more firm going forward. There is a real sense that actually diplomacy by itself isn't working, and that it's not just vis-a-vis the Trump administration, it's also vis-a-vis the rest of the world. We look weak. We're not weak. We have tools. We have ways that we can respond, and we need to now show our muscle. So I think that's going to be something that might surprise us.
Super. Martin, what could surprise us?
Surprise could be that at the end of the year, we find ourselves in a situation where NATO is not fundamentally weaker than it was at the beginning of the year. That through some sort of subtle diplomacy, we managed to survive this moment of tension and to make NATO relevant to the Trump administration is the goal not only of the organization but of many European allies. And I'm not sure this is the most likely scenario, unfortunately, but this could be a surprise.
Fantastic. Martin, Georgina, Peter, thank you very much indeed for being with us. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, not only about the crisis of the week, but also about the transatlantic relationship more broadly and what we might expect over the next year, in fact. We're very grateful to that. Let me also say that, GMF is doing a lot of work in this space, which is not surprising for an organization that focuses on strengthening transatlantic cooperation, which is an interesting challenge these days, but a very, very important one. And I would encourage all of you to have a look at what we're doing. It's on our website. There will be more things coming. It's all super interesting. And please do have a look. Let me also thank my colleagues on the strategic convening team at GMF who put all of this together. We're very, very, very grateful for that. And above all, thanks to all who have joined us online. We look forward to seeing you again, either virtually or in person in any of our offices. Thank you.